Yeah, 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 yeah. Hi, good morning. So I thought that I would start with a story. 3 years ago, when I was still a student at Harvard, we were waiting for the Red Line subway, and I was with some friends from Boston University. We were having a conversation that we often had. See, at the time, I was studying mind, brain, and behavior. This is an interdiscipline combining philosophy, psychology, human evolutionary biology, computer science, and a few others. And I wanted to make the point, which is the point I want to make here for you all today, that philosophy is not merely an academic discipline, something intangible or inapplicable to our everyday life, and it is not something of religion's past, but rather it is part of our basic brain mechanisms. And in fact, we are always already making moral decisions. We can look to our consciousness and understand our biases so that we may make better decisions in the future. So we were waiting for the train to come, having this conversation, and all of a sudden, I saw at the end of the tracks 5 people. They were tied down to the tracks, and coming towards them was a speeding train, unmanned, and if I didn't do something, it would hit them and they would die. Next to me was a lever, and if I pulled the lever, it would change the train from one track to the other. But at the end of that track was a separate one person tied down. So I was faced with a dilemma. Do I allow the 5 people to die, allow the train to continue? Or do I switch the lever, revert the train to the one person, but save the 5? As you may have guessed, there were no 5 people tied down, there was no lever. But this is a simulation that we gave to people in the Harvard Moral Psychology Lab. And here what we did is we would put people in fMRI machines, give them moral dilemmas, change them up a bit, and see how people would answer, what parts of their brain would light up, and how could they change their decisions. So when most people answered this question, they would say, yes, you should pull the lever, you ought to save the 5 people more than the one. And I have a slide here. Well, anyway, what they would say is, when they answered yes to this question, the part of their brain that would light up is a more ancient part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal, the posterior cingulate gyrus. And this is associated with computing, and the responses they would give would be more utilitarian. You ought to choose the better outcome based on how much value, how many lives are saved. But then we would ask the same question slightly differently. So we would ask them, imagine now that you are on the subway, you're waiting for the subway, the train's coming, the 5 people are still there. But this time, instead of a lever, you notice a person in front of you. He's wearing a lot of gear, he looks like he's a weary traveler, he's not really paying attention. But you notice that if you push him onto the tracks, you could save the 5 people, but you would lose him. Now, people would answer this very differently. They would say, no, you ought not to push the man. And when they did this, the same part of the brain would light up, but also 2 other areas of interest. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a more recent part of the brain in primates that's associated with social judgment, would light up, as well as the area associated with response conflict. So the theory here, Joshua Green's theory of dual process, is that at this type of question, we are facing a dilemma between the utilitarian decision and the deontological decision that we ought not to harm others. And nowhere did I see this sort of decision-making and the biases that went into this, because it is a bias. We were able to change their decisions by giving them different conscious math problems and things to go through. They would change their decisions. Nowhere did I see this more prevalently than when I was working on the cage-free egg campaign at my university. As it sounds like, we would go across campus and ask students and faculty to sign this petition to bring cage-free eggs to campus. Now, most people know rationally the type of atrocities that go on in the factory farming system. They can point to them, but it's different when you receive, for example, your eggs in the dormitory. They're in a nice styrofoam package. They have a cute little picture of a farm and a chicken on there, and you're very distant. You're as distant from them as you are in the case of the one person on the track. But then this is very different than knowing it emotionally, viscerally, having that sort of experience of harm close to you, as in the case of the traveler that you would push off onto the train. So these are pictures here of the natural habitat of chickens in a caged environment. And we noticed when we showed these sorts of images to people that they would reconsider their original stance. And the space here that they have is no larger than a piece of paper. They can barely turn around. And the next slide shows that the sort of harm that comes to them, the way that their feet sort of mangle and bleed from standing all day on the metal wiring. This is also harmful to us. It's very unsanitary conditions with chickens stacked on top of each other. And the next image is, we see this all across the industry, pigs as well, unable to turn around, their piglets having to be fed to them through bars. And it's not only just harm to the animals, but also harm to the people who work in the industry. So the slaughterhouse workers, Eric Schlosser calls it the most dangerous job in America. And indeed, we see people being injured consistently on this job because of the fast-paced environment. It's what causes a lot of disease to spread because they're working so quickly, and then the animals might suffer if that's not done properly. Also, we have some numbers here on global warming and the way that this sort of production of factory farmed meat specifically affects the environment. As the UN said, it's more affecting of the environment than all of transportation together, the production of meat, in the way that we are currently doing it. And so we were successful in this campaign. We brought cage-free eggs to the campus, but it made me realize and that we all often engage in moral rationalization rather than moral reasoning. And this is understandable. We grow up in a society in which it is normalized to eat certain ways. We're fed these foods from the very beginning, and it's hard to see how the system actually functions when it's distant from us. But while our moral sense has allowed us to do great things, it's allowed us to build bridges, to work as humans with each other, to trust each other, to build hospitals and get in the car and get on the plane with each other. It hasn't yet adapted to our increasingly globalized world. The more distant you are, the harder it is for you to understand the suffering of someone else. And we see this in your own psychology. So while God may be dead, as Nietzsche says, morality doesn't need to be with it. And so the next time that you sit down for dinner, you can think visually, you can feel emotionally, and you can understand the sorts of biases that may be playing into your decision making, so that you know it's your biased opinion that matters most. Thank you.